My name is Leo. For the last month, I've been a night security guard at the Chamberlain Museum of Antiquities in downtown Chicago. To most people, that probably sounds either incredibly boring or vaguely exciting, like I'm living in one of those movies where the exhibits come to life. The truth, for the first 3 weeks and 6 days, was firmly in the boring camp. The pay is decent, the work is solitary, and my main responsibilities involve making sure no one's trying to steal a $1 million vase and that the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, what we call the HVAC, doesn't decide to call it quits in the middle of a sub-zero January night. The museum is a different beast after dark. During the day, it's a symphony of noise. The echoing chatter of school groups in the grand hall, the soft shuffling of feet on polished marble, the hushed tones of art lovers admiring a centuries-old canvas. But at night, all of that is stripped away. The silence that's left behind is so profound, so heavy, it feels like a physical presence. It presses in on you. The only sounds are the ones you make, the squeak of your rubber-soled shoes, the jangle of keys on your belt, the static-laced click of your walkie-talkie when you call in your hourly check. My orientation was a rushed affair. The head of security, a man named Sal, looked like he'd been part of the museum's foundation since they laid the first stone. He was a barrel-chested man with a face like a road map of every back alley in Chicago, and he smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and menthol cigarettes. He walked me through the patrol routes, showed me the emergency cutoffs, and explained the camera system with a series of grunts and pointed fingers. On my last night of training, just before he handed me the keys for my first solo shift, he did something strange. He pushed the official 3-inch thick binder of protocols across the security desk. It was full of corporate jargon, fire safety regulations, and laminated emergency contact lists. "This," he said, tapping the binder with a thick, nicotine-stained finger, "is for them. The people upstairs, the insurance adjusters. It keeps them happy." Then he reached into the breast pocket of his worn blazer and pulled out a small, folded piece of yellow legal paper. It was soft and frayed at the edges, as if it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. He slid it across the desk. It felt different from the binder. It had weight, a history. "These," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, "are for you. These are the rules that matter. You follow these, no matter how little sense they make. You don't ask why. You just do them. Got it?" I nodded, my curiosity piqued. I unfolded the paper. The writing was a messy, urgent scrawl written in fading blue ink. It was a list. 1. All assets in the Century of Progress exhibit must be secured within their designated enclosures by 2359. No exceptions. Final check. At midnight. 2. The salt line at the threshold of the Nile, permanent collection must be maintained. Check for breaks hourly. 3. If a call comes from an unlisted extension after 2 a.m., do not answer. The list went on, 8 rules in total, each one more cryptic than the last. I wanted to ask what he meant by assets, or what would happen if I missed the deadline, but the look on Sal's face was a locked door. It was the kind of look old men get when they've seen too much and have no interest in seeing it again through a rookie's fresh eyes. "Just do the job, kid," he said, and then he was gone, leaving me alone in the sterile quiet of the security office. For the first few nights, I followed the first rule without incident. The Century of Progress exhibit was on the 2nd floor, a sprawling recreation of scenes from the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. It was the museum's creepiest section, hands down. It was populated by about 24 mannequins, posed in little vignettes of life from a bygone era. A family listening to a cathedral-style radio, a scientist showing off an auto-writer machine, a group of socialites in flapper dresses and tuxedos clinking empty cocktail glasses. They weren't your typical department store dummies. These were commissioned works of art, crafted from wax and porcelain with an unnerving, lifelike detail. They had glass eyes that seemed to catch the low, ambient light of the emergency fixtures in a way that felt far too aware. Their painted-on smiles, meant to convey joy and optimism, looked like predatory smirks in the deep shadows. Every time I did my 11:30 p.m. patrol through that wing, I couldn't shake the feeling of being an intruder, a meat-and-bone animal wandering through a silent, plastic world that was just waiting for me to turn my back. The procedure was simple enough. Each mannequin, or asset as the note called them, was housed in a large glass-fronted display case. My job was to go to each case, ensure the figure was in its correct catalog position, and then lock the heavy glass door with a special brass key. The click of the lock echoing in the dead air was always a satisfying, final sound. Tonight, however, was different. I started my lockup patrol at 11:40 p.m., leaving myself plenty of time. I moved through the exhibit methodically, my footsteps the only sound. I locked in the radio family, their vacant eyes staring straight ahead. I secured the inventor, his hand forever frozen over a gleaming, useless gadget. One by one, I went down my checklist, the clink and scrape of the brass key marking my progress. I was down to the last section, the cabaret scene, a lavish display with 5 figures arranged around small, circular tables. I locked in the bartender, the band leader, and a laughing couple at a corner table. That left just one, the socialite. She was positioned near the front of the display, one hand on her hip, the other holding a long, empty cigarette holder. Her head was tilted, her painted red lips curled in a knowing smile. Of all of them, she unsettled me the most. Her eyes seemed to track me as I moved. I walked up to her case. My heart, which had been beating at a slow, steady rhythm, gave a painful lurch. The heavy glass door was slightly ajar, and the case was empty. A cold, chemical dread flooded my veins. It was the kind of primal fear that bypasses thought and goes straight to your lizard brain. My first thought was that it was a prank. Sal, or one of the other guards, hiding it to scare the new guy. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp white cone through the gloom. I swept the light across the exhibit floor, and there she was. She was standing about 15 feet away, beside the inventor's display case. She hadn't just been moved, she was different. Her body was angled toward the inventor's workbench. Her head turned as if she were inspecting his contraptions. Her cigarette holder, which was supposed to be pointed jauntily toward the ceiling, was now aimed directly at the other mannequin's head. It was a subtle, impossible change. I checked my watch. 11:53. 7 minutes until midnight. Sal's words echoed in my head. No exceptions. I didn't know what the consequences were, but the sheer irrational strangeness of the situation made me certain I didn't want to find out. My feet felt like lead blocks, but I forced them forward. "Okay, Leo," I whispered, the sound ridiculously small in the cavernous room. "Just put it back." Touching it was the worst part. The wax of its skin was cold, but not the inert cold of plastic. It felt like cold flesh, clammy and dense. It was heavier than it looked, an awkward dead weight. I gripped it by its waist and its shoulder, and a faint, musty smell, like old perfume and dust, filled my nostrils. I tried to move it, and for a terrifying second, it felt like it was resisting, its joints refusing to bend in the direction I needed. I had to plant my feet and heave, my breath fogging in the cool air. The whole time those glass eyes were staring blankly into the middle distance, that painted smile, fixed and mocking. I half-dragged, half-carried it back to its enclosure, my boots scuffing on the floor. Getting it back onto its small pedestal was a clumsy, frantic struggle. Its limbs didn't want to cooperate, and I nearly dropped it twice. Finally, it was back in place. I slammed the thick glass door shut. The sound boomed like a gunshot in the silence. My hand was shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the brass key into the lock. I twisted it, and the bolt slid home with a heavy, final thunk. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, a cold sweat plastering my shirt to my back. I looked up at the socialite. She was exactly as she was supposed to be now, head facing forward, cigarette holder pointed up. But I swear, I absolutely swear, her smile was wider than it was before. It was no longer a smirk. It was a look of triumph. My wrist vibrated. My watch alarm. It was midnight. I slowly backed out of the exhibit, my eyes locked on the mannequins until I was safely in the hallway. I leaned against the cool marble wall, the frantic drumming of my heart gradually slowing. The official rulebook in the security office felt like a joke. This folded, yellowed piece of paper in my pocket was the only thing that was real. It was a list of instructions for a job I didn't understand, in a place that was clearly not what it seemed. I pulled out the paper again, my fingers still trembling, and smoothed it against the wall. My eyes fell to the next item on the list. 2. The salt line at the threshold of the Nile Permanent Collection must be maintained. Check for breaks hourly. My patrol route would take me past the Egyptian wing in another 30 minutes. A new, deeper knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The night was still young, and I was starting to realize that surviving until sunrise was not going to be as simple as just keeping the doors locked. The adrenaline from the mannequin incident left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. For a good 20 minutes, I just stood in the main rotunda, my back pressed against a pillar cold enough to feel through my uniform jacket, and tried to get my breathing under control. My mind was a frantic scramble of denial and terror. It was a prank. It had to be. Sal must have a master key, snuck in, moved it to mess with me. But how could he have changed its posture? How could he have been so silent? The more I tried to stitch together a logical explanation, the more the seams ripped apart, revealing the impossible truth I had just manhandled back into its glass prison. My walkie-talkie crackled to life, the sound making me jump out of my skin. Sal's voice, a gravelly rasp filtered through the cheap speaker, broke the silence. "Status report, Leo. Rotunda." I fumbled to unclip the radio from my belt. "Leo here," I managed, my voice sounding thin and reedy. "All clear in the rotunda. Heading toward the east wing now. Copy that. Stay sharp." The line went dead. Stay sharp. The advice felt about an hour too late. I was already sharpened to a razor's edge of pure, unadulterated fear. A glance at my watch told me it was 12:35 a.m. Time to start my next patrol loop. My route would take me past the Ancient Egypt exhibit, officially called the Nile Permanent Collection, and my eyes, against my will, were drawn back to the second rule on Sal's folded, yellowed list. 2. The salt line at the threshold of the Nile Permanent Collection must be maintained. Check for breaks hourly. Compared to the frantic, last-minute horror of the mannequins, this one seemed almost quaint. A salt line. It was the kind of thing you read about in folklore, a superstition from a time before electricity and science. During my training, Sal had pointed it out. It was a thin, perfectly straight line of coarse white crystals laid across the massive granite threshold of the exhibit's entrance. When I'd asked him what it was for, he just grunted. Pest control. I had assumed he meant insects or mice, a cheap, old-world solution to a common problem. Now, I wasn't so sure what kind of pests he was talking about. As I walked through the echoing marble corridors, the air grew still and heavy. The east wing felt older than the rest of the museum, the architecture more monolithic and imposing. The light from the emergency fixtures seemed to get swallowed up by the dark stone walls. The entrance to the Nile collection was designed to impress, Two massive red granite pillars flanked a doorway that was dark enough to be a hole punched straight through the fabric of reality. The air here was different too. It was dry, still, and carried a faint, dusty scent, like clay and old paper. I tried to rationalize it as I approached. This was a hazing ritual. The mannequin was step 1, to get me rattled. The salt line was step 2, a silly task to make the new guy feel foolish. I imagined Sal watching me on a security camera, chuckling to himself as I dutifully inspected a line of seasoning on the floor. The thought gave me a small, fragile sliver of comfort. My flashlight beam cut through the oppressive gloom, and I aimed it at the floor. The salt line was there, a stark white slash against the dark, polished stone. From a standing position, it looked fine, but Sal's rule said to check it. That meant getting close. With a sigh that was half exhaustion, half anxiety, I crouched down, my knees protesting with a faint pop. I ran the beam of my light along the line from left to right. It was maybe a quarter-inch wide, a neat, continuous barrier. Then my light stopped. Right in the center of the threshold, there was a gap. It wasn't large, maybe an inch wide at most. It wasn't a natural erosion either. The salt crystals were scuffed and scattered, exactly like someone had dragged the heel of their shoe through it, breaking the line. But I was the only one in the museum, besides Sal, who was locked in the main security hub 2 floors down. My patrol hadn't brought me this way yet tonight. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't a prank. The moment my brain registered the broken line as a real, tangible problem, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a slow change. It was instantaneous, like a switch being flipped. The first thing I felt was the cold. It wasn't a draft from a vent or a poorly sealed door. This was a deep, predatory cold that radiated outward from the darkness of the Egyptian exhibit. It was a tomb cold, a chilling absence of heat that felt ancient and dead. It sank into my clothes, into my skin, right down to the marrow of my bones. I could see my breath plume in front of my face, a white cloud in the beam of my flashlight. Then came the sound. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it, a high frequency ringing in my ears from the stress. But it grew, resolving itself into a distinct noise. It was a whisper, a dry, sibilant, rustling whisper, like sand being blown across a sarcophagus lid, or 1,000 dried leaves skittering over stone. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I could recognize. It was guttural and harsh, full of long, drawn-out hisses and sharp, clicking sounds. And it was coming from the pitch-black darkness beyond the broken salt line. It sounded like a multitude of voices, all whispering at once, weaving in and out of each other in a chorus of dust and decay. My blood turned to ice. Every instinct I had, the deep, primal part of my brain that knows when to run from a predator, was screaming at me to get up and get away, to leave the East Wing, to lock myself in the security office and not come out until the sun was up. But Sal's face flashed in my mind, his warning absolute. You follow these no matter how little sense they make. This wasn't just a rule, it was a function, a procedure, and I had a sinking feeling I was looking at a catastrophic system failure. A new smell accompanied the sounds, faint but unmistakable. It was the scent of dry, cracked earth, of a place that hadn't seen moisture in millennia. Beneath that was a cloying, spicy aroma, like myrrh and cedarwood, the funeral spices you read about in history books. It was the smell of a well-preserved corpse. My training manual had a whole section on investigating unusual noises, but the yellowed paper in my pocket had a different directive. The salt line must be maintained. One set of rules was for the world I knew. The other was for the world I was in now. I knew which one to follow. Sal had given me a small, cylindrical plastic canister, like a large salt shaker, filled with the same coarse crystals. It was in a side pocket of my duty bag. My fingers felt like clumsy, frozen sausages as I fumbled with the zipper. The whispering from the darkness grew slightly in volume, becoming more insistent, more agitated. It felt like they, whatever they were, knew I was there. They knew what I was about to do. I got the canister out. My hand was shaking violently, the plastic rattling against the flashlight I was trying to grip in the same hand. I knelt on the cold stone floor, my back to the doorway. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, to deliberately turn my back on that sound, on that cold, on that ancient, malevolent presence. The whispers lapped at the back of my neck. I could feel a pressure building in the air behind me, a static charge that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. I tilted the canister, and a stream of white crystals poured out onto the stone. I moved my hand carefully, filling the gap. The salt looked impossibly bright and clean against the dark floor. As the last crystals fell into place, completing the line, the whispers rose to a furious, hissing crescendo. It was a sound of pure, venomous frustration. For a terrifying split second, I felt a wave of pressure against my back, as if a great, unseen weight was pushing against the very air in the doorway. And then, in an instant, it was over. The moment the line was complete, the phenomena ceased. The whispers vanished, cutting off so abruptly it was like a speaker had been unplugged. The soul-deep cold receded, the air returning to the normal, chilly temperature of the museum at night. The smell of dust and ancient spices dissipated, leaving only the faint scent of ozone from the nearby electrical fixtures. The silence that returned was different from before. It wasn't empty. It was a contained silence, a locked door silence. The line of salt on the floor no longer looked like a superstition. It looked like a weld, a seal, a desperate and fragile dam holding back a dark, whispering ocean. I stayed kneeling for a full minute, my forehead resting on my clenched fists, just breathing. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I understood now. The rules weren't hazing. They weren't a joke. They were countermeasures. They were the thin, fraying threads holding the fabric of this place together. I had just patched a hole, and I had the chilling realization that there were 6 more rules on that list, 6 more potential breaches in security that had nothing to do with burglars or fires. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, my joints aching from the phantom cold. I brushed the salt dust from the knees of my trousers and took one last look at the unbroken line, a fragile ward against the things that slept and whispered in the dark. I turned my back on the Egyptian wing for good and continued my patrol, my footsteps sounding unnervingly loud in the newly silent halls. My mind raced ahead to the quiet solitude of the security office and to the third, ominous rule on Sal's list. 3. If a call comes from an unlisted extension after 2 a.m., do not answer. The night was a long way from over, and I was beginning to fear the ringing of a telephone more than anything I could imagine. After the incident at the Egyptian wing, the security office felt less like a workplace and more like a decompression chamber. It was my small, brightly lit island in a vast, dark ocean of whispering history. The office was a cramped, sterile space tucked away behind the grand hall, windowless and functional. Its main feature was a large curved desk dominated by a bank of 16 black and white CCTV monitors. Their silent, ghostly flicker painted the room in a constant shifting monochrome glow. On a normal night, I found their humming presence comforting. Tonight, they just felt like 16 portholes looking out into an abyss, and I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was looking back. I made myself a cup of coffee, the cheap, bitter kind that comes in a giant tin can and tastes like burnt dirt. I needed the warmth in my hands, the acrid smell, the jolt of caffeine, anything to feel grounded in the mundane world of lukewarm beverages and buzzing electronics. For the next hour, I did my best to be a normal security guard. I watched the monitors, seeing nothing but empty hallways and silent, sleeping exhibits. I logged the time I'd patched the salt line, my entry in the official logbook, a masterpiece of understatement. 12:41 a.m. Inspected East Wing threshold. All secure. What else could I write? Heard whispers from a long-dead civilization, sealed them back in their tomb with table salt. I was pretty sure that would earn me a psychiatric evaluation and a pink slip. The clock on the wall, a simple institutional circle with a jerky, stuttering second hand, ticked relentlessly toward 2:00 a.m. Each click was a small hammer blow against the silence, a countdown to the next potential crisis on Sal's list. I unfolded the yellowed paper again, though I had already memorized the next line. 3. If a call comes from an unlisted extension after 2 a.m., do not answer. Of all the rules, this one seemed the most straightforward, if no less strange. The museum's internal phone system was a relic. In the corner of the office, next to a filing cabinet full of decades-old incident reports, sat the main switchboard console. It was an old cord and plug model from the 60s, now bypassed by a slightly more modern digital system from the 90s. A single, heavy black Bakelite phone sat beside it, more of a museum piece than the artifacts out on the floor. Most wings had these old phones mounted on the walls, beige plastic boxes with rotary dials, all connected to this central hub. They were rarely, if ever, used. We had walkie-talkies for a reason. An unlisted extension was a mystery. Did it mean a number that wasn't on the official directory? A line that was supposed to be disconnected? I ran my finger over the dusty surface of the Bakelite phone. It was cold and inert. The idea of it ringing felt as likely as the whale skeleton in the grand hall getting up and doing a lap. The second hand on the clock crawled past the 12. It was 2:00 a.m. Nothing happened. The monitors showed nothing but shadows. The silence held. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Maybe this rule was a dud. Maybe it was a relic of a past problem, a faulty wire that had long since been fixed. I took a sip of my coffee, the bitter warmth a small comfort. I allowed myself a moment of hope, a fragile belief that the rest of the night might just be a long, boring stretch until dawn. That hope shattered at 2:07 a.m. It started not with a ring, but with a click from the old switchboard. A single amber light on the panel blinked on, next to a faded, typewritten label that read, Extin 413. I didn't recognize the number. My eyes darted to the official extension list taped to the side of the console. The numbers only went up to 350. Then, a sound crackled through the small speaker embedded in the console, a sound that was piped in from the main PA system for just this purpose. It was a phone ringing, but it wasn't the familiar, warbling tone of a modern telephone. It was a harsh, mechanical, brutally loud brrring, brrring, the sound of a physical metal bell being struck by a hammer, amplified and echoed throughout the entire museum. It was a grating, piercing shriek of a sound designed to cut through the daytime din of crowds and chatter. In the dead silence of the night, it was utterly monstrous. The sound assaulted my ears, seeming to come from everywhere at once. It vibrated through the desk, up my arms. It felt less like a call and more like an alarm, a siren warning of some unspeakable breach. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the phone's relentless ringing. Do not answer. The words on the paper were a lifeline. My job, my official, binder-approved job demanded I do the opposite. An unanswered phone could be an emergency, a staff member trapped in a room, a cleaner having a heart attack, anything. My duty was to locate the source and render aid. My hand hovered over the switchboard, my fingers twitching with the urge to plug a cord into the blinking jack, to lift the heavy receiver and say, "Security, Leo speaking." But the memory of the mannequin's mocking, triumphant smile, and the memory of that soul-sucking cold from the Egyptian wing held me frozen in place. Those were not pranks. They were not malfunctions. They were violations of a natural order I never knew existed. And these rules were the only damn thing that had fixed them. The ringing was relentless. Burring, 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 burring. It didn't pause for more than a second. It drilled into my skull. I had to get away from it. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor, and decided to do a patrol. Maybe if I put some distance between myself and the main office, the sound would be muffled, easier to ignore. I walked out into the grand hall, the ringing echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings, turning the vast space into a colossal bell jar of noise. I headed for the West Wing, toward the Hall of Ancient Americas, putting as much architecture as I could between myself and the source. But as I walked, a new, horrifying realization dawned on me. The sound wasn't getting fainter. If anything, it was getting louder. It was as if the phone wasn't ringing in one location, but in every location at once. I hurried my pace, my rubber soles squeaking a frantic tempo. I reached the entrance to the Americas exhibit and paused, listening. The ringing was sharp and clear, seeming to come from just around the corner, from an old phone mounted on the wall near the Mesoamerican pottery display. The sound was so localized, so immediate, that I could almost feel the wall vibrating with it. Then I glanced back toward the security office and saw it on the long-range monitor I could just make out through the doorway. The light on the switchboard flickered. The amber light for X10-413 went out, and in the exact same instant, another one lit up. X525, another number that didn't exist, another call from nowhere. And the sound, the horrible grating ringing, was no longer coming from the Americas exhibit. It was now coming from ahead of me, from the Hall of Oceanic Arts, the next stop on my patrol route. It was following me, or more accurately, it was anticipating me. It was waiting for me. The phone in whatever room I was about to enter would begin to shriek, beckoning me forward, drawing me deeper into the museum's dark, labyrinthine corridors. It was a lure. It was bait. And I was the thing being hunted. I stopped dead in my tracks, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The dilemma wasn't about whether or not to answer the call. The dilemma was about the call wanting to answer me. I turned and fled, not walking, but not quite running either. A panicked, shuffling retreat back to the relative sanity of the security office. The entire way, the ringing chased me, the source light on the switchboard blinking from one phantom extension to another, always erupting from the hallway just in front of my path. I slammed the office door behind me, the sound lost in the cacophony of the bell. I sank into my chair, my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block out the noise. The amber light on the panel for XD201, the security office's own unlisted internal line, was now blinking. The phone on the desk, the black Bakelite dinosaur, began to scream. It was so loud, so violent, the entire desk vibrated. It was a physical assault. I stared at it. My breath hitched in my chest. It wanted to talk to me. It had followed me home. I clamped my eyes shut, reciting Sal's rule like a prayer, a mantra against the sonic invasion. Do not answer. Do not answer. Do not answer. I don't know how long I sat there. a prisoner in my own office, besieged by that single, maddening sound. It felt like an eternity. My coffee was cold. My muscles ached from tension. And then, as suddenly and inexplicably as it had begun, it stopped. The cutoff was so abrupt that the silence that rushed in to take its place was a physical blow. It was a deafening, roaring void that pressed in on my eardrums. The amber light on the switchboard went dark. The world was still again. But the silence was different now. It was heavier, tainted. It was no longer an absence of noise. It was the presence of something holding its breath, waiting. The phone system wasn't dead. It was dormant. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul that it could wake up again at any time. I shakily lifted my gaze to the clock on the wall. It was 3:15 a.m. The ringing had lasted for over an hour. My shift was only half over. My eyes, guided by a sense of morbid, terrified obligation, fell back to the folded yellow paper on the desk. My next patrol would take me through the second-floor European galleries. 4. Never turn your back on the weeping woman for more than 30 seconds. Leaving the security office after the phone incident felt like stepping off a lifeboat into a dark, churning sea. Silence the phone had left behind was a fraud. It wasn't peace. It was a listening, waiting void. Every familiar sound, the hum of a ballast in an overhead light, the whisper of the ventilation system, the distant groan of the building settling, now felt alien and deliberate. I felt watched, not by cameras, but by the very architecture of the place. The museum was aware of me, and it felt like I had just failed some crucial, unspoken test by refusing to pick up its call. My patrol route dictated that my next check-in was the European Renaissance Gallery on the second floor. The thought of climbing the grand staircase, of moving deeper and higher into the oppressive darkness, made the muscles in my legs feel weak. But the alternative, staying put and waiting to see what would happen if I neglected my duties, was infinitely worse. The rules, as terrifying as they were the only thing that had worked so far. They were a strange and terrible kind of armor. I pulled out the yellowed paper, my thumb smudging the faded ink. 4. Never turn your back on the weeping woman for more than 30 seconds. The European Gallery was, by day, one of the most beautiful spaces in the Chamberlain. Sunlight streamed through massive arched windows, illuminating masterpieces from centuries past. At night, it was a tomb for the wealthy and the powerful. The anemic glow of the emergency lights flattened the vibrant colors of the paintings into dull, bruised-looking shades of gray and black. The figures in the portraits, lords and ladies and stern-faced merchants, became a silent, judgmental audience, their painted eyes following my every move from beneath layers of dark, cracked varnish. The air was still and cold, smelling faintly of linseed oil, dust, and something else, something vaguely floral, like funeral lilies. I knew which painting the rule referred to as soon as I entered the long rectangular hall. It wasn't the largest or the most famous, but it had a gravity all its own. Titled Portrait of a Lady in Mourning, it depicted a pale, dark-haired noblewoman against a stark, almost black background. Her face was the focal point, a study in abject sorrow. Her eyes, a deep, liquid brown, were cast downward, fixed on something beyond the frame. Her lips were parted just slightly, as if she had just released a sigh of profound grief. There were no visible tears on her cheeks, but the artist had somehow managed to paint the feeling of them. An aura of unshed, eternal sorrow that was almost physically palpable. Locals and staff just called her the Weeping Woman. I stood before the painting, my flashlight beam aimed at the floor so as not to cause any damage. The rule seemed absurd, even by the standards of the night so far. The mannequin had been a physical object, the salt line a physical barrier. The phone, a mechanical system. This was just pigment on canvas. What could it possibly do? But I was learning. The rules weren't about what things could do, but about what they already did. My patrol required me to walk the length of the gallery, check the emergency exits at the far end, and walk back. A simple procedure that would force my back to be turned to the painting for at least a minute or two. I looked at the portrait, then down the long, shadowed stretch of the hall. A cold dread, separate from the ambient chill of the room, trickled down my spine. I decided to test it, a small test. I stood in the center of the room, directly in front of her, and slowly turned around. I counted to 5 in my head, the numbers feeling loud and clumsy in the silence, then turned back. The painting was unchanged. The woman was still gazing downward, lost in her painted grief. I let out a shaky breath. It was probably just the power of suggestion, another one of Sal's psychological games to keep me on edge. But I had to be sure. I had to follow the rule. I began to walk the length of the gallery, but I did it backwards. It was a clumsy, awkward process. I kept glancing over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't about to trip over a velvet rope or a display bench, my eyes darting back to the painting every few seconds. She remained static, a fixed point of sorrow in the cavernous room. I reached the far end, checked the push bar on the emergency door to ensure it was locked and alarmed, and started the slow, backward journey to the entrance. It felt ridiculous, but the memory of the hissing whispers and the shrieking phone was still fresh. Ridiculous was safe. As I drew level with the painting again, I stopped. I had to know. Was this rule real, or was I just spooking myself? I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and turned my back on her. I looked straight down the hall at the faint red glow of the exit sign at the other end, and I started to count. 1, 2, 3. The silence pressed in, no longer passive, but charged, expectant. 10, 11, 12. I could hear the frantic thump of my own heart, a fist beating against the inside of my ribs. 20, 21, 22. The floral scent in the air was stronger now, thick and cloying. It was the smell of lilies left too long in stagnant water. 28, 29. A sound. It was so quiet, so faint, I almost missed it. It was the sound of a sharp, wet intake of breath, a choked, desperate gasp for air from someone trying to hold back a sob, and it came from directly behind me. 30. My blood ran cold. Every nerve ending screamed at me to either run or freeze, to do anything but turn around. But the rule wasn't about what would happen to me. It was simply a statement of protocol. Never turn your back for more than 30 seconds. I had reached the limit. I had to turn back. I spun on my heel, my flashlight beam jerking upwards, involuntarily illuminating the painting, and my breath caught in my throat. It was different. The change was subtle, yet earth-shattering. The woman's face, which had been rendered in the dry, matte finish of centuries-old oil paint, now looked slick, wet, as if it were weeping oil. Her expression was no longer one of passive, distant sorrow. The grief was active, immediate, and raw. Her lips, which had been slightly parted, were now drawn back in a silent O of anguish, and from the corner of her right eye, a single, glistening tear had escaped, tracing a dark, viscous track down her pale cheek. It wasn't paint, it was something else, something that caught the beam of my flashlight and shone with a terrible, liquid life. The sound had stopped. The choked gasp was gone. There was only the painting, its sorrow now manifest, a quiet, impossible violation of reality. I finally understood. The rule wasn't a threat. It wasn't to protect me from her. It was to protect her from being alone with her grief. My job wasn't just security guard. It was warden, witness, a silent companion to the sorrow trapped behind the canvas. By turning my back, I had abandoned her, and her composure had broken. I stood there for a long time, my light trained on her altered face, a strange and unwelcome mix of terror and pity washing over me. I had broken a rule, or at least bent it to its absolute limit, and the consequence was a quiet, heartbreaking escalation. This was the new normal for this room, a weeping portrait that I had to comfort with my mere presence. Slowly, carefully, I began to back out of the gallery, my eyes never leaving her face. I didn't turn around until I was safely in the corridor, the heavy wooden door swinging shut with a soft, final click. I leaned against the wall, my legs trembling. My 3 a.m. lunch break was approaching, a small island of promised normalcy in a night that had become anything but. I reached for the list, dreading what new procedure I'd have to perform in the cavernous grand hall. 5. Leave a piece of fresh meat on the center of the marble star before your 3 a.m. lunch break. The encounter with the weeping woman left a different kind of chill in me than the other incidents. It wasn't the sharp, aggressive fear from the phone or the primal dread from the Egyptian wing. It was a deep, lingering melancholy, an emotional residue that clung to me like the cloying scent of the funeral lilies. I felt less like a security guard and more like a participant in the museum's strange, nocturnal grief. My boots felt heavy as I descended the grand staircase, my mind replaying the image of that single, glistening tear on the canvas over and over. It was 2:55 a.m., time for my designated half-hour lunch break. Normally, this was the highlight of the shift, a quiet moment of solitude to sit in the brightly lit office, eat my sandwich, and feel blessedly, boringly normal. But tonight, that normalcy felt a million miles away. And of course, there was a rule attached to it. I pulled out the list, the paper now feeling like a cursed artifact in my hands. 5. Leave a piece of fresh meat on the center of the marble star before your 3 a.m. lunch break. My patrol route always concluded back in the grand hall, the museum's cavernous heart. It was an awe-inspiring space, 3 stories high with a vaulted glass ceiling that, during the day, flooded the hall with light. At night, it was a pit of darkness, the ceiling lost in an impenetrable blackness far above. Suspended in the center of this immense void was the museum's most famous exhibit, the complete 80-foot-long skeleton of a blue whale. It hung from thick steel cables, a leviathan of bone floating in a sea of shadow. During my first few shifts, I'd found it beautiful. Now, it just looked menacing. Its massive rib cage looked like a cage for some unimaginable beast, and its skull, with its vast, empty eye sockets, seemed to watch over the entire museum with a dead, eternal vigilance. Directly beneath the whale, set into the floor, was the marble star. It was a compass rose, an intricate 10-foot-wide inlay of black and gray marble. Its points aligned perfectly with the cardinal directions. It was the exact center of the building, the point from which everything else radiated. And tonight, it was an altar. A new problem presented itself: fresh meat. I wasn't a butcher. I was a night guard who packed his own lunch. I made my way to the security office, the whale's shadow looming over me the entire way, and opened my sad little lunch bag. Inside was a thermos of coffee, an apple, a small bag of potato chips, and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, turkey and Swiss on rye. It was the best I could do. Feeling like the world's biggest fool, I unwrapped the sandwich. I carefully peeled off the top slice of bread, then took the folded half-moon slices of smoked turkey, the best part of the whole sandwich, and stacked them together. It was a pathetic offering, a small, pale pile of processed deli meat. The thought of placing it on the floor in the middle of this grand, silent hall felt profoundly stupid, but the memory of the consequences of my previous hesitations spurred me on. The weeping portrait, the hissing darkness, the phantom phone calls. They had all seemed stupid too, right up until the moment they weren't. I walked back out of the office and into the center of the grand hall, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the vast space. The air here was still and cold, and it carried the dry, ancient scent of bone. Standing on the edge of the marble star, I felt incredibly small, a tiny, soft-shelled creature, standing beneath the skeleton of a dead god. I knelt down, the cold of the marble seeping through the knee of my trousers. With a deep breath, I placed the small stack of turkey slices directly on the center point of the star, where all the lines converged. It looked absurdly small and pink against the polished black stone. I stood up and backed away slowly. Nothing happened. The hall was as silent and still as it had been a moment before. I felt a flush of embarrassment. Maybe this was the prank. Maybe Sal would review the camera footage tomorrow and have a good laugh at the new guy leaving a sacrifice for the floor tile. With a final dubious glance at the offering, I retreated to the office for my break. I ate my mangled, meatless sandwich and the rest of my lunch, my eyes glued to the CCTV monitor that showed the grand hall. The camera was mounted high up, giving a wide, distorted view. The marble star was visible, but the meat was too small to be seen on the grainy, low-resolution display. For 30 minutes, I watched the screen, seeing nothing. The hall remained empty. No rats, no stray cats who might have somehow gotten in. Just perfect, uninterrupted stillness. At 3:30 a.m., my break was over. It was time to go back. As I walked back into the hall, a new kind of tension gripped me. It was the fear of the unknown outcome. I approached the marble star, my flashlight beam leading the way, tracing a path across the polished floor. I aimed the light at the center. The meat was gone. My heart gave a painful thud. It wasn't just gone. The spot was clean, perfectly, impossibly clean. There were no smears, no grease marks, no crumbs, nothing to suggest an animal had been there. It was as if the meat had simply ceased to exist. I ran my fingers over the spot. The marble was cold and smooth. I straightened up, my senses on high alert. My flashlight beam swept the floor around the star, finding nothing. It traveled up the walls, across the empty balconies of the second and third floors. Nothing. Then, almost against my will, I aimed the light straight up into the immense, cavernous darkness of the ceiling, toward the skeletal whale. My light played across the ancient, yellowed bones of the rib cage, the long, curved jaw, the immense skull, and then I saw the shadow it cast. On the vast, vaulted ceiling above and behind the skeleton, the bones threw a complex web of blackness. A second, spectral whale, painted in pure shadow. It was a familiar sight, but tonight, a part of it was wrong. There was a patch of shadow near the head of the skeleton that was darker than the rest. It was a subtle, sickening detail, like a pool of ink spilled on a black coat. It was a piece of the night that was blacker than the night around it. As I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the patch of absolute blackness moved. It didn't shift as a shadow would if the light source moved. It detached. It peeled away from the skeleton's shadow with a slow, silent, fluid motion, like a leech letting go of skin. It was impossibly huge, an amorphous blot of living darkness, and it flowed across the high ceiling with a terrifying, silent grace. It had no discernible shape or form, only an impression of immense, weightless bulk. It was a hole in the world. It drifted toward the darker, unlit side of the ceiling. a river of void flowing through the rafters, and then it was gone, absorbed back into the absolute blackness of the architecture. The entire event lasted no more than 5 seconds. I stood frozen in the center of the grand hall, my flashlight beam still pointing at the empty ceiling, my mouth hanging open. The building wasn't just haunted, it was a habitat, and I was beginning to understand that my job wasn't to keep people out, it was to keep the residents inside, fed and placated. The grand hall was no longer just an entryway, it was a feeding ground, and whatever I had just fed was big enough to swallow the world. A new layer of fear settled over me, a constant background hum of terror. I was no longer just patrolling empty hallways. I was walking through cages. Shaking, I pulled out the list one more time, my eyes finding the 6th rule, the one for the new temporary exhibit on the 3rd floor. 6. If you see a man in a bowler hat in a reflection who is not in the room with you, do not make eye contact. Turn and walk away. Do not run. The sight of that impossible shadow, that piece of living void, had fundamentally rewired my understanding of the museum. My previous encounters had been with entities that were contained in a display case, behind a salt line, within a painting, on a phone line. They had boundaries. The shadow in the grand hall was different. It was a predator, and the hall was its hunting ground. I was no longer just a guard in a building. I was a groundskeeper in a private reserve, and I had just fed one of the larger specimens. The knowledge was a heavy, cold weight in my gut. My next patrol took me to the 3rd floor, to a newly opened temporary exhibit called Reflections of the Gilded Age. The irony was not lost on me. After seeing a living shadow, the last thing I wanted to do was walk into a room designed to distort reality. The Hall of Mirrors, as the staff called it, was a long, narrow gallery. The walls were painted a deep, light-swallowing burgundy. There were no paintings, no sculptures, just about 30 ornate, freestanding mirrors of all shapes and sizes, arranged in a maze-like configuration. There were tall, severe Victorian pier glasses, squat, round Regency mirrors with gilded eagle frames, and elaborate Venetian mirrors with etched glass borders. The effect was immediately and profoundly disorienting. Every step I took was multiplied into infinity. I saw a dozen versions of myself from a dozen different angles. My blue uniform, a repeating motif in the dark room. My own reflection became a stranger, a silent army of Leos marching through a fractured, labyrinthine world. The low emergency lighting was captured and thrown back from every surface, creating confusing, overlapping pools of light and deep, impenetrable pockets of shadow. The silence here was different too. It was a dead, padded silence. The velvet on the walls and the thick carpet on the floor absorbing all sound, leaving only the frantic thumping of my own heart. I took out the list, the paper's edges now soft and frayed from my nervous handling. 6. If you see a man in a bowler hat, in a reflection, who is not in the room with you, do not make eye contact. Turn and walk away. Do not run. I scanned the empty room. There was no one here. The rule was clear. The threat was not in the physical space, but in the reflected one. My job was to patrol the exhibit, ensuring no glass was cracked, no antique frame had been jimmied. It was a task that forced me to look, to inspect the very objects that might house this phantom. I felt a bead of cold sweat trace a path down my temple. This wasn't a test of bravery, it was a test of discipline. I began my patrol, my movements slow and deliberate. With every mirror I passed, I forced myself to focus only on my own reflection, on the physical reality of the object in front of me. I'd check the frame, look for smudges on the glass, and move on. All the while, I was acutely aware of the dozens of other reflected images of myself in my peripheral vision. I fought the urge to look at them, to see if they were all still mimicking my movements perfectly. The thought that one of them might not be was a low, simmering hum of terror beneath my forced composure. I was about halfway through the gallery when it happened. I was inspecting a large, oval-shaped mirror with a heavy, dark mahogany frame. My reflection, pale and strained, stared back at me. As I leaned in to check the integrity of the frame, my eyes flickered to another mirror behind my right shoulder, a tall, thin cheval glass that was angled slightly toward me. In its reflection, I could see my own back, and standing just behind me, almost close enough to touch my shoulder, was a man. My blood turned to solid ice. He was tall and unnaturally still, dressed in a severe, old-fashioned black suit, the kind you'd see in a photograph from the turn of the 20th century. He had a crisp white collar and a thin black tie, and on his head, pulled low, was a dark, round bowler hat that cast his face in complete shadow. There were no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, just a dark, ovoid shape beneath the brim. He was just there, a static, silent figure in the glass, a perfectly rendered impossibility. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that if I turned, the space behind me would be empty. He only existed in the reflection. The first instinct, the one that screamed from the most primal, ancient part of my brain, was to meet his gaze in the mirror, to challenge him, to try and understand what I was seeing. The rule flashed in my mind, a bright, clear warning: do not make eye contact. He was looking down, his featureless face angled toward the floor, but I felt that if I stared long enough, he would lift his head. I felt that magnetic, terrible pull, the desire to see what was in the shadow beneath the brim. I had to physically wrench my eyes away, forcing myself to look back at my own reflection in the mahogany mirror in front of me. The second instinct was even stronger. Run, flee, get out of this broken, funhouse version of reality and never look back. The word blazed in my mind: do not run. My heart was a jackhammer against my ribs. My breath was a ragged, shallow thing in my throat. I was trapped, not by the man, but by the rules of the encounter. This was a test of nerve, a formal, terrifying etiquette I had to perform correctly. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like pure fire, I forced my body to obey the instructions. I broke my gaze from all of the mirrors. I focused on a patch of burgundy velvet wall between two of them. I took a slow, deliberate breath. Then I turned my body, not quickly, but at a measured, even pace, until my back was to the cheval glass where I had seen him. My entire nervous system was screaming. The feeling of that silent, reflected figure being behind me was a tangible pressure, a physical weight on my back. Every instinct told me he was about to reach out, that cold, spectral fingers were about to close around my neck. Walk away. I put one foot in front of the other. The scuff of my rubber-soled shoe on the thick carpet sounded like a cannon shot in the dead silence. I did not look at any of the other mirrors as I passed them. I kept my eyes fixed on the exit at the far end of the hall, a rectangle of blessed, ordinary-looking corridor. Each step was a battle between my will and my panic. My legs wanted to sprint, to break into a desperate, scrambling run, but the rule was absolute. I walked. It was the longest walk of my life. When I finally crossed the threshold and stepped out of the hall of mirrors and back into the main corridor, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it made my knees buckle. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air, my whole body trembling. After a minute, I risked a look back into the exhibit, From the doorway, I could see the cheval glass. Its surface was empty, reflecting only the opposite burgundy wall. He was gone. I hadn't been attacked. I hadn't been chased. I had simply been observed, judged on my ability to follow the rules. It was a far more intimate and terrifying violation. I was starting to think the entities in this museum didn't want to kill me. They just wanted me to learn the dance. I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and that floor. My next check-in was in the archives, in the deepest part of the sub-basement. It felt like the safest place in the world right now. As I made my way to the service elevator, I pulled out the list, my hand shaking too much to properly fold it. 7. If you hear this playing, wind it until it stops. The service elevator that led to the sub-basement was more of a freight cage than a passenger lift, a rattling metal box that descended into the earth with the slow, metallic groan of a dying machine. With each floor I passed, the polished marble and warm wood of the museum proper gave way to raw concrete and exposed, color-coded pipes. The air itself changed, losing its dry, curated stillness and taking on the cool, damp mineral scent of a cave. After the hall of fractured realities and the bowler-hatted phantom, this descent into the guts of the building felt less like a chore and more like a necessary retreat. Down here, at least, things were solid and real. The archives were the museum's forgotten attic and cluttered basement all rolled into one. It was a labyrinth of towering industrial steel shelves that rose 15 feet high, disappearing into a ceiling crisscrossed with thick bundles of wiring and old plumbing. The aisles between them were narrow, barely wider than my shoulders, creating a sense of profound claustrophobia. The only light came from bare bulbs in wire cages, spaced too far apart, which cast long, distorted shadows that made the shelves look like the ribs of some colossal, long-dead beast. The air hummed with the low, steady drone of industrial-grade dehumidifiers, a constant, monotonous sound that did little to combat the underlying feeling of deep, undisturbed silence. My job here was simple, a single walkthrough to check for leaks, pests, or fire hazards. It was the most mundane task of the night, and I was deeply grateful for it. I started my patrol, my flashlight beam cutting a path through the dusty gloom. The shelves were crammed with acid-free cardboard boxes, wooden crates stamped with faded inventory numbers, and artifacts deemed too minor or too damaged for display. A crate of Roman pottery shards, a rack of Civil War-era rifles slick with cosmoline, a taxidermied owl with moth-eaten wings that stared at me with dead glass eyes. It was the museum's subconscious, a cluttered, disorganized repository of history's leftovers. I was about halfway through the maze, the dehumidifier's hum, a familiar background noise, when I first heard it. It was a sound so thin and delicate, it barely registered. A needle-thin thread of melody weaving through the heavy drone of the machinery. I stopped, holding my breath, tilting my head to listen. There it was again, a simple, 8-note tune, played on what sounded like tiny metal teeth. It was a music box. The melody was faint, wistful, a simple lullaby tinged with a deep and inescapable sadness. It sounded impossibly old and impossibly lonely. My blood, which had just started to warm back up to a normal temperature, turned to slush. I didn't need to consult the list. The final active rule of the night had just been triggered. 7. If you hear this playing, wind it until it stops. The sound was coming from somewhere deep in the archives. I turned off my walkie-talkie to cut out any potential static and began to move, my footsteps now unnervingly loud on the gritty concrete floor. I was hunting a sound. The melody would grow slightly stronger as I went down one aisle, then fade if I took a wrong turn. It was a ghostly game of Marco Polo, in a steel catacomb. The tune never varied, repeating its sad little loop over and over. A tiny mechanical ghost trapped in an endless cycle of sorrow. I finally traced it to a dead-end aisle, packed to the ceiling with old wooden furniture draped in white dust cloths, making the shapes look like a congregation of shrouded figures. On a high metal shelf, tucked behind a stack of leather-bound ledgers, was a small, dark wooden box. It was utterly unremarkable, about the size of a shoebox, with no carvings or embellishments. It was coated in a thick layer of gray dust, as if it hadn't been touched in 100 years. A small yellowed shipping tag, the same kind of paper as Sal's list, was tied to its tarnished brass winding crank. The rule was written on it in the same faded, spidery handwriting. The music was clearer now, trickling from the simple box with a tinny, heartbreaking clarity. It was time to follow the procedure. I had to drag over a heavy wooden stool to reach it. As I cleared the dust off the top, my fingers left clean trails. There was no visible switch or button to stop the music. The only option was the crank. I put my hand on it. The brass was cold, and I could feel the faint vibration of the clockwork mechanism inside. With a deep, steadying breath, I began to turn it. The resistance was immediate and unnatural. It wasn't the tightness of an overwound spring. It was a heavy, sluggish refusal, like I was trying to crank a winch, pulling a great weight up from a deep well. The music didn't stop. In fact, as I forced the crank through its first rotation, the melody changed. It was the same tune, but it was no longer simple. New notes appeared, frantic, discordant harmonies that twisted the sad little lullaby into something that sounded like panic. The tempo increased, the notes tumbling over each other in a desperate, breathless rush. It was no longer a song, it was a plea. The sound filled the narrow aisle, seeming to bypass my ears and drill directly into my skull. I kept winding. My arm started to ache, my knuckles white from the strain. The box grew perceptibly colder in my other hand, a deep, unnatural chill that sank into my fingertips. The music grew more complex and harrowing with every turn. I could almost feel the emotion behind it, a wave of pure, undiluted grief and terror, so powerful it made my own eyes begin to sting. I wasn't just winding a machine, I was churning a memory, forcing some trapped, spectral energy through its cycle. Then, just as I felt my muscles would give out, the resistance vanished. The crank spun freely, almost weightlessly in my hand. The frantic, panicked melody began to slow. The discordant notes fell away, leaving only the original, simple, heartbreaking tune. It played through one final, achingly slow time, each note hanging in the dusty air like a teardrop, before the final note sputtered, held for a beat, and died. Silence. The drone of the dehumidifiers rushed back in to fill the void, but the silence from the box was absolute. It was a heavy, dead silence, a silence that had weight and presence. I had done it. I had contained it. I gently placed the box back on the shelf, behind the ledgers, exactly as I had found it. My hands were trembling. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the small, dark box until it was lost in the shadows. I had survived the night's trials. One by one, I had faced the museum's phantoms and followed their strange, esoteric rules. I glanced at my watch. The glowing hands read 4:48 a.m. Dawn was approaching, but my night wasn't over. As I walked toward the elevator to ascend from the museum's depths, my mind was consumed by the 8th and final rule on Sal's list. It wasn't a reaction to a phenomenon. It was a scheduled event, a final, horrifying appointment I had to keep. 8. Unlock the unmarked service door in the sub-basement from 5:00 a.m. to 5:01 a.m. precisely. Do not look. Lock it again. Ascending from the archives in the groaning freight elevator was like rising from a deep, dreamless sleep into a waking nightmare. The mundane physical challenge of the music box had been replaced by the cold, stark anticipation of the final rule. This one was different. It wasn't a defense, a reaction, or a placation. It was an active, willing participation in the museum's unseen schedule. It felt like the most important and most dangerous rule of them all. My watch read 4:55 a.m. I had 5 minutes. The unmarked service door was, according to Sal's brief and grim description during my orientation, in a section of the sub-basement even deeper than the archives, a place of raw bedrock and humming electrical transformers. I found it at the end of a long, concrete corridor, dimly lit by a single, flickering fluorescent tube that cast everything in a sick, greenish light. The door itself was utterly anonymous. It was made of heavy, rust-streaked steel, with no window, no handle, and no markings except for a single, heavy-duty industrial lock set into the metal. It looked less like a door and more like a plug, a seal holding back the immense pressure of the earth. The air here was cold and smelled of damp soil, ozone, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible scent that was sharp and metallic, like old blood or fresh rust. This was the end of the line, the final task of my shift. I pulled out the folded, yellowed list one last time. It was practically falling apart at the seams now, a fragile testament to the night's horrors. The final rule was stark in its simplicity, yet terrifying in its implications. 8. Unlock the unmarked service door in the sub-basement from 5:00 a.m. to 5:01 a.m. precisely. Do not look to see what, if anything, comes through. Do not engage. Just unlock it, wait 60 seconds, and lock it again. The key for this door was different from the others on my ring. It was a single piece of heavy black iron, almost medieval in its construction, with a complex, jagged bit. Sal had called it the janitor's key, a name that felt like a grim, cosmic joke. I stood before the door, the key clutched in my sweaty palm, my eyes fixed on the glowing digits of my watch. 4:58. The only sound was the incessant, maddening buzz of the dying light overhead and the frantic drumming of my own blood in my ears. What was I about to do? Was I letting something in? Was I letting something out? The vagueness of the rule was a special kind of torture. The mannequins, the whispers, the painting, the shadow, the man in the mirror, the music box. Were they all just distractions? Were they the museum's internal security system, the strange but manageable phenomena that kept the guards busy while the real business of the night was conducted down here in the dark? 4:59. 1 minute to go. My mind raced. I imagined what could possibly be on the other side of that door. Another dimension? The museum's secret, living collection? Or just a simple service tunnel leading out into the Chicago night? A designated exit for the things that roam the halls after dark? The possibilities were all equally terrifying. Do not look. That was the most important part. Whatever this was, I was not meant to be a witness. I was just the gatekeeper, a blind and ignorant operator. My watch vibrated. 5:00 a.m. It was time. My hand was shaking so badly, it took 2 tries to insert the heavy iron key into the lock. The metal felt cold enough to burn. The lock was stiff, as if it hadn't been turned in a century. I had to put my shoulder into it, gritting my teeth as I turned the key. With a deep groaning chunk that echoed down the concrete corridor, the bolt slid back. The door was unlocked. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then I felt a change in the air pressure. A subtle, silent rush of wind flowed past me, out of the museum and through the doorway. It was a cold, stale wind, carrying the scent of dust and myrrh and old bones from the Egyptian wing, the faint, floral scent of lilies from the gallery, the dry smell of ancient paper from the archives. It was like the museum itself was exhaling, a single, collective sigh of release out into the world. Then, the 60 seconds of waiting began. I did what the rule said. I turned my back to the open doorway and stared at the opposite concrete wall, my eyes fixed on a dark water stain that looked vaguely like a screaming face. I counted in my head. 1,000, 1,000. The silence behind me was absolute. There were no footsteps, no whispers, no rattling chains or monstrous growls. There was nothing, and that nothing was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. The absence of noise was so profound, it felt like a presence in itself, a vacuum into which all my courage and sanity were being pulled. My imagination, free from any sensory input, ran wild. I pictured the bowler-hatted man stepping silently through the door. I imagined the great devouring shadow pouring out into the pre-dawn city. I imagined the mannequins walking stiffly out of their prison, their painted smiles fixed in the gloom. 31, 1,000, 32, 1,000. A new smell reached me, faint but clear, overriding the musty exhalation of the museum. It was the smell of the city just before dawn. Rain-damp asphalt, car exhaust, the faint, clean scent of Lake Michigan on the breeze, the world outside. Was I letting them out to hunt, or were they just going home? 58, 1,000, 59, 1,000. My watch vibrated. 5:01 a.m. 1 minute had passed, an entire eternity compressed into 60 seconds. With a gasp of relief that was half a sob, I spun around. I didn't look into the corridor beyond the door. My eyes were locked on the door itself. I slammed the heavy steel plate shut. The sound was a deafening boom of finality. I threw my entire weight into turning the key, my muscles screaming with the effort. The bolt shot home with another bone-jarring chunk. It was done. I sagged against the cold steel, my forehead pressed to the metal, my body trembling with a mixture of residual terror and profound relief. I had survived. I had followed the rules. I had kept the museum and its secrets for one more night. As I finally made my way back to the security office to sign out, the first pale gray light of dawn was beginning to filter through the high windows of the grand hall. The whale skeleton was no longer a menacing titan, but just a collection of bones. The portraits in the galleries were just paintings. The museum was beginning to put on its daytime face, its mask of normalcy. When Sal arrived to relieve me, looking as rumpled and tired as always, he gave me a long, searching look. He didn't ask how my night was. He didn't have to. He just nodded, a flicker of something. Respect, pity in his tired eyes. "You did good, kid," he grunted, and that was all that was said. As I walked out into the cool morning air of the city, the sounds of traffic and life washing over me, I felt like a soldier returning from a war no one else knew was being fought. The folded yellowed paper was still in my pocket. I knew I wouldn't throw it away. It was my guide, my scripture, my key to surviving the night. Because I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would be back. I had to come back. I was part of the system now. I was a guardian of the things that slept and wept and waited in the dark, and my shift was only just beginning.